Hello and welcome back to the Faith and Culture Show. I'm Catherine Camp, your hostess for the show. And this is where we dig into all types of topics. And we do this in order to educate ourselves so that we can have those conversations with our culture, conversations that count, conversations with an eternal perspective. And today we are going to dig deeply into what the Bible actually says about Nimrod. Many people recognize the name, but they're not sure where it came from. If it's in the Bible, where did they hear it? We know that there were writings long before Scripture was actually penned. But we also know that there are ways to track down individuals in the Bible because of the way dating used to take place. Much the same way people would probably date our day today. And I'm going to let Dr. Douglas Petrovich tell us all about it. He's an adjunct professor of biblical history and exegesis at Brooks Bible College. He teaches remotely from his home in Richmond, Texas. He previously taught and administrated at the Bible Seminary, Texas, Shepherd's Theological Seminary in North Carolina, and Novosibirsk Bible Theological Seminary in Siberia. He completed a Ph.D. and MA in Syro-Palestinian archaeology from the University of Toronto and has his Master's in Theology in New Testament and Master's of Divinity from the Master's Seminary. He is incredibly well educated. He became an ordained pastor in 1998. Later serving as a church planting pastor in Bryansk, Russia. He appeared in 2 documentary films, Pattern of Evidence, The Moses Controversy, and Is Genesis History? And I would suggest that if you haven't seen them, you definitely need to go look at those documentaries. He has some, like all of us, has specializations. And his are biblical languages and exegesis, biblical and ancient Near East history and archaeology, which is where my eyebrows were raised, and lower textual criticism and epigraphy, and Egyptology. So I am very excited to have him on the show. He's a very busy man in high demand. And so let's get him on the Faith and Culture Show.
Great to be with you and your viewers today. Lots of fun that we get to have on this very specific topic of Nimrod. There's a lot we could talk about, but this topic in itself will take all of our time today, I think.
I think so too, especially going over it with you earlier and are going back and forth with the questions. Because there's so many, it would be easy for me to get distracted because I know you have so much information. And so we need to go ahead and get started. I want to go ahead and start by just asking you, is that I know my first question, because we wanted to go about it chronologically, about the survivors of the flood, because we're looking way back in history. we know that Nimrod was after the flood, but there are a lot of people that talk about the possibility that Nimrod was a half-breed or a hybrid. So without confusing everyone, I wanted to ask if there are any survivors of the flood that somehow carried on with this corrupted genetic line of the human race that the flood was intended to wipe out. Were there any survivors?
Sure, yeah, that's a good question. And I could kind of go about this in several different ways. The first thing I want to say, though, is I really don't subscribe to the theory that some people hold that there was a purely godly line versus a purely evil line. I think that's very much oversimplifying things and not really getting a full perspective on just what was happening at the time. But all pre-flood mankind was tainted and corrupted by sin. That's, I think we can all agree on. And at the same time, there were a few exceptional godly people who kind of stood out in contrast to this godless majority. And the names maybe that pop off the page the most for me are Enoch and Noah. Now, they weren't without flaw and they weren't without sin. Certainly that's something that, again, all of us should agree on. But they were unique. They were different. And they were part of the line, not the godly line, but the line that would go down to the promised people, right? The people of, through Abraham, through Isaac, and then all of Jacob's family. And then that line would go down to Messiah, the promised one, the coming prophet, as Moses describes in the 18th chapter of Deuteronomy. But Catherine, there's something really fun with your question that I want to share with you that I'm guessing this will be news to you. This is, I think, pretty exciting. So since you mentioned this, this genetic line, I want to talk about genetics for a minute here.
Good.
The genetic connection between pre-flood and post-flood people, I think, is visible in one kind of what's called a kind of a class of mankind, early mankind, and that's Neanderthals. Okay. Now, the first discovery of Neanderthals dates to 1856 BC. I'm sorry, AD. So that's 150 years ago or so. Well, what distinguishes them? What makes them different than the typical hominids? Because we would call ourselves hominids, and they actually were hominids too, but they were a kind of a different ilk of hominid. And their features include a strangely projected brow over their eyes, mm-hmm. and an impressive muscular body. And usually they were short. They're definitely shorter than the average bear, with, contrasting them to other humans of their day. But they were just as behaviorally sophisticated as modern hominids are, right? So they're not less than mankind in any stretch of the way of the imagination. Okay. So evidence of interaction between Neanderthals and standard hominids does exist. So this strongly suggests to us, and I think all archaeologists and all biologists and earth scientists would agree that Neanderthals, well, those of us who are young Earth, as I am, that the Earth, the age of the Earth exists in thousands of years and not in millions of years. But we would say that that this evidence of interaction between Neanderthals and standard hominids does exist, and that suggests to us that they were post-flood and that they were running around with the descendants of Noah. Okay, now the most direct evidence for their interaction is from Western Europe, and that's where Neanderthal-type stone tools kind of gave way to tools that became typical for standard hominids that look like we did, basically. Now, meetings between Neanderthals and standard hominids also took place in the ancient Near East, such as in the land of Israel, the Carmel mountain range. That's where in 1 Kings 18, Elijah is standing up against the prophets of Baal and Asherah. And also in Asia, and especially in the Altai Mountains, which, by the way, was very close to where I lived in Novosibirsk, which is, just a couple hundred miles away. So there's are plenty of places where we see connection between the regular hominids like we are and the Neanderthals. And there was also interbreeding between them because there's skeletal evidence of this hybridization. So Neanderthals and standard hominids definitely did interbreed. About 70 to 80% of people alive today have Neanderthal DNA in them. And that's probably most of us. Most of us have some percentage. If you were to do a DNA check and say, do I have evidence of Neanderthal in me? Probably it would come out positive. So most of the 20 to 30% of the people with no Neanderthal DNA come from the sub-Saharan African part of the world. So that's kind of the biggest concentration. There are a couple other places, but that's the biggest one. Now, one of the world's leading geneticists, his name is Dr. David Reich. He's from Harvard Medical School. He published a book in 2018 on what he learned about Neanderthals through cutting-edge genetic research. And I'll just read you the title. It says, Who We Are and How We Got Here. And the subtitle is Ancient DNA and the New Science of the Human Past. So that's David Reich. That's the name of the author. He's secular. He's at Harvard University, but he is literally one of the leading experts in the world on whole genome research. So he's very interested in the ancient world. So in his book, he devotes a good part of it to what he learned through genetics about the ancient world. And here's what he learned. He saw, well, first of all, he looked over at Europe and he saw this one big main whole genome research laboratory, and it was doing great work, but it really couldn't handle all the worldwide work that needed to take place, people wanting to get work done. So basically what he did is he knew that if he could create this factory-like super laboratory here in the United States, kind of like what Henry Ford did with automobiles, right?
Okay.
That much more could be learned, and it could be learned much quicker. And again, his area of specialization is whole genome research, which basically means the studying of the entire genome at one time, rather than just studying small stretches of it using mitochondrial DNA. So you can you can multiply your results by many times over by quickly studying the whole genome. And that's exactly what he did. So he had this laboratory built. It was built at Harvard University. And here's what he found. And this is what applies. So mitochondrial DNA, an analysis of it proved that Neanderthals' DNA type was outside the range of present variations in hominids, and that Neanderthals shared maternal line ancestors with modern humans. So we can trace back maternally through each one of us, we can trace back our DNA, and it matches up with this. If there's an element of Neanderthal DNA in us, it can trace that along back generation to generation, going back very far in time. So the DNA evidence could not exclude up to about 25% contribution of Neanderthals to the DNA of present-day non-Africans, even if modern humans outside of Africa do have substantial Neanderthal ancestry. Let's say we're some of the people who have, we're in that 70 to 80%, and we have Neanderthal DNA. For us, there are only, as we go back then in history, there are only one or a few, this is what he determined, only one or a few women who lived at that time who were lucky enough to pass down their mitochondrial DNA to present-day people. So Reich could not believe his eyes, because this meant that everyone alive today with Neanderthal DNA in them can trace back their maternal line to 1 to 3 women, right? Which sounds crazy. He couldn't believe this. it made no sense to him that this could be done. So what he did is he cleaned the labs, right, where he did the research, cleaned them, spick and span. And he totally reworked his research, came out with the same conclusion. He still wasn't satisfied. He cleaned the labs again. He did another test, same results. He still wasn't satisfied. So he took samples and he shipped them to this original laboratory in Europe, in Germany, and they did a study of his materials, having cleaned their lab beforehand, and they concluded exactly the same thing. Everyone with Neanderthal DNA can trace their maternal line back to 1 to 3 women. This is really weird. Doesn't make any sense with how we understand Earth history, at least from a secular framework. So here's the point. How many childbearing women were on the ark in Noah's day? How many?
3.
Yeah, 3. So if 1 or 2 of the 3 wives that were on that ark had Neanderthal blood, that can account for the 70 to 80% of people today with Neanderthal DNA. And if 1 of the 3 wives did not have Neanderthal blood, that accounts for the 20 to 30% of people without Neanderthal DNA. So this kind of crazy evidence makes absolutely no sense to secular biology, but it makes perfect sense if humanity kind of came through this bottleneck, right? Like the middle of an hourglass, right? And that middle of the hourglass is the moment of the flood when only 3 childbearing women were there. It makes perfect sense to a biblical worldview. Isn't that wild?
That is wild. That's pretty awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I had not heard about that study. And when we spoke earlier, the person I was commissioned by to write the book I was telling you about, he is a genomist and was at Cornell for 3 decades. And he had looked into it, and of course he did lots of research, probably about the same time that this other doctor did, and they had gotten, they went all the way back to their our genomics, and it kept coming back to 2 people, the original 2 people, and so that's a lot of his writings are on that. That's very exciting about the Neanderthal. Now, what do we know about, how does Nimrod fit into this? Do we think that maybe he was Neanderthal, or do we think that some of the people may have, I guess, survived this flood that came? And just the reason I ask is because, like you said, you do not prescribe to what I know as the Sethian view, where there was this line of pure, sinless race, and then you had those who were, I guess, from Canaan or that line that were not sinless. They were sinful, and so they were, that's what when Genesis 6, that's what I'm trying to get to, is Genesis 6 when it says that the sons of man, the sons of God came down and interluded with the daughters of man. And so that just doesn't make sense to me, because that would mean that every female on the planet was bad and had bad blood, or bad genetics.
Right.
Or was just evil. And the only ones that were pure were these, that one line. So, sorry, that was a long introduction to just kind of wondering, do we think any of those survived? Because we know God wanted to wipe out. It was just so evil.
Yeah. And I would say, no, there are no survivors. Now, I don't know exactly, Catherine, what your view is on Genesis 6. I'm very kind of, having researched it a ton, I'm pretty locked in on what I'm convinced is the right view, which is that these are evil angelic beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which kind of bothers us that God would allow Satan to have some of his henchmen come down to earth, in spirit form, and take on the form of human beings and have all of the functions of mankind. Now, that shouldn't surprise us, because God and angels both, and we see this, many times in the Old Testament, where they appear. The appearance of God to Abraham, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he ate together. So God appeared in a way that he had all the faculties of a human being and could even consume food.
Yes.
As Abraham did. So that shows us it's very possible. But so I'm convinced that these evil angelic beings took on human flesh, and that at the time of the flood, they were subject to what we are. They were localized. They had a three-dimensional body, and they were limited to what they could do in that three-dimensional body, right? With gravity, restricting them as much as it does us, right?
Yeah.
So when we read about them in the New Testament, Peter talks about this. It's alluded to in Jude as well. When even a reference in Ephesians, Jesus at the time of his death, right? So he leaves his body and he's alive still in spirit. What does he do in spirit? And again, that's Ephesians. And then Peter tells us that he went and he proclaimed something to the spirits who were alive in the days of Noah, right? What spirits? Well, it says, Peter tells us they were in a specific prison that was separate from anywhere else. And it's in the center of the earth. We know that from Ephesians. So that was where it was located. And he went there to proclaim something. And it's not the Greek word for to evangelize. That's evangelizo. It's the verb keruso, which means to proclaim. It's what a town crier does when he needs to give an announcement, right? Something going on in the city. So Jesus announces to these spirit beings who were alive in the days of Noah. And the text doesn't tell us what he told them, but we can infer, I think, fairly clearly what he told them, which was, guess what? Your plan to corrupt the line that was supposed to be a purely human line to go from Adam all the way to Messiah. That plan is foiled. It's over. It's done. It failed, because I am the Son of God who has conquered sin and death. And all of that was accomplished at the cross. And now I live forevermore. And I'm going to depart, to be with my Father. And all things will happen as we outlined in Scripture, right? So that was the general gist of it. Right. So that, I think, reflects that all of the evil spirit beings who took on human flesh in Genesis 6 died in the flood, just as every other man and woman that wasn't aboard that vessel with Noah. They all died, and this was Jesus's way of essentially rubbing it in, right? And saying that he was victorious. So no, none of them survived the flood. They all died. The human beings who weren't part of this group of angelic beings who had this special prison, they probably would have gone to the place. If Jesus is literal when he talks about the contrast between these two pockets, right? Before he dies, he's giving a parable, and he talks about Abraham's bosom and others who are dead in a place of pain and suffering and sorrow, right? So if Jesus is literally giving us correct theology there, if he's not just making up a falsehood to communicate a story, and I don't think that's the way he worked. Right. But if he's being literal and correct, then there's this other pocket, if you will, that the spirits of the human beings who weren't part of those corrupt angels, they would have been there. So there are no humans and no evil angelic beings who survive the flood in a way that they're living on planet Earth. Does that make sense?
It does. And we're never going to get to Nimrod, but now that you've brought up that, I wanted to ask, what is your thought? What are your thoughts on a lot of people believe that, okay, humans were never designed to be put in hell. We were supposed to be with God in communion, but all of this messed everything up. And these human beings that, because they, the Bible tells us that they had children with these women, and that, the evil increased on the earth. Well, we know with that, everybody has a spirit, and perhaps their spirit was corrupted and the flesh died in the flood. But many people believe that, and this is where what I've looked into, that those spirits didn't die yet, just not the original 200 or however many are supposed to come down, but the ones from the procreation, the ones who were born later and inhabited or came with the half human, half demonic entity, that their spirits did not die, and those are the demons that still plague the earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I would say is, okay, I'd make a distinction.
Okay.
There were plenty of followers of Satan, evil angelic beings, who weren't part of this group that was, bequeathed with the ability to take on human flesh and cohabitate with women. And by the way, I don't think that was marriage. I think that was rape. That's full-blown rape.
Yeah, it was violent.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
very violent. So they're doing what they want. So I would just say that the other evil spirits remain unbound and not in prison. So from the fall of Satan, when he has those henchmen, right? All of those who weren't part of this group who took on human flesh that we read about in Genesis 6, all of them have remained in unbound form as spirits and continue to do the work of the evil one. And by the way, of course, God is ultimately the one doing his purpose. And so it's God who's using Satan to accomplish his purposes so that he wouldn't taint his hands, kind of like David, right? With the armies of his foreign enemies. He was the one doing all the bloodshed, so he couldn't build the temple. So his son, who wasn't involved in all that bloodshed, was able to, right? So there's just this sanctity, I think, that's involved in that. But these evil angelic beings, they were bound and remain bound, and I think they're still there in the center of the earth where they heard the message from Jesus, and nobody has access to them. They don't have access to anyone else. So they're restricted. But all of the other angelic beings, evil angelic beings, are able to move to and fro. You see in Job that some of them go with Satan into the presence of God. They come and go. They make accusations. They have desires to do things to certain individuals, and they ask God's permission. If God grants it, then they go and do it. So I would say that all of them have not died, but everyone who took on human flesh. So every evil angelic being who took on human flesh, every descendant of Adam pre-flood, and every person born who was a half-breed or some percentage of one and the other, they also all died. I think as long as they had humanness in them, as long as they were at least, half human, they would have gone to this holding area that Jesus talks about. That's the opposite of Abraham's bosom. Okay. And it's only the evil angelic beings who came from Satan, who were not human to begin with. Only they went to this special prison where Jesus visited.
You're right. Okay. And I do know that in the New Testament, it does say, it tells us, we might be entertaining angels and not know it. I think that's one of Paul's writings.
Yep.
You would probably know better than I do.
Yeah.
Okay.
And these would be good angels, right?
Yes. Yes. So, because, if we give a cup of water or are good to somebody that, we've never met before, they might actually be an angel and just kind of there testing us, I guess.
Yes.
Okay. So my second question about getting back into Nimrod, what are the steps that you take to investigate a biblical character objectively who is not readily identifiable historically? And this would be like Nimrod.
Exactly, like Nimrod, because many of the characters that we read about in the Bible, we know exactly who they are, right? There's Pharaoh Necho and ECO. We can tell you exactly when he ruled and what dynasty he was a part of and what were his exploits and that kind of thing. We can match him to a historical figure. But in rare cases, we can't really easily or readily connect a biblical personage to a historical person. And yes, at that point, then we need to have kind of a sound methodology for how we do that. So yeah, that's how I want to answer this for you. So since the Bible is the only ancient source that's inspired by God, at least I believe that, and I think you do too, I have to start with that source first. Not the historical sources first, but the Bible first. So I first study the biography of that biblical character carefully, learning everything I can about the details. So I just kind of try to turn over every stone, figuring out everything I can know about that person. So this gives me a kind of a list then of biographical requirements. So like in 2006, I came out with a journal article attempting to identify a certain Egyptian pharaoh with the Exodus pharaoh, right? Amenhotep II. So, and I studied, his, I studied the chronology, first and found all these possible ways, but, things about the Exodus pharaoh. I had to then match any potential connection to, or any potential person who could be that Exodus pharaoh. I had to match that potential historical figure with the biographical requirements. So you basically just line them up against this king, right? That kind of thing. So that's kind of where it starts. So if possible, I determine where he or she fits on the timeline of absolute dating, or at least a time range. And for me, it's the kind of thing where, as a historian, and even one who's studied biblical history for decades now, I see the great value in chronology if we can match up a time period on what we call the timeline of absolute dating. We know it as something BC and something AD, right? So it's kind of like what hermeneutics, or the interpretation of the Bible, is to biblical studies. In the same way, chronology is to historical studies. It gives you a framework. It gives you a range. It gives you a limitation, so that you're not just playing pin the tail on the donkey. And trust me, Catherine, I've seen so many scholars even, and those who have engaged in biblical studies, try to make connections between the Bible, something that happened in the Bible, something that happened in history, where they may as well just be putting a blindfold over their eyes and spin around 3 times and try to plant this poker on this historical person. And that is not good methodology. That's terrible methodology. So you start with the chronology, which means you start with biblical chronology first. You go to the ancient culture you're looking at and see if you can establish a sound chronology for that ancient people, whether it's the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, or whoever, right? So then I look for historical characters who fit the chronological range, if I can determine one, a specific year or a range of years. So I find historical characters who fit that chronological range and possess one or more of the biographical requirements of the biblical character in question. Now, some of those characteristics of that biblical character, some of those deeds or traits or that kind of thing, you're not going to be able to measure those or see if they're in some historical person. It's not like you can match everything. It's not that clean and crisp. But you just keep comparing one after another biographical requirement, say of the Exodus Pharaoh or of Nimrod or somebody, to this historical person. You're kind of, and it's a hypothesis, right? You're putting in a question out there. Is it possible that so-and-so could be Nimrod, right? So you're trying to do it objectively. There's no skin in the game. You're looking for the right match. You're not looking to force a match. So you line up those characteristics, and as soon as you find one requirement that does not fit, let's say that contradicts a required characteristic of a person, Exodus, Pharaoh, Nimrod, then all of a sudden it's over. It's done. Okay. It's got to be 100%. If you've got the right person, that person will meet 100% of the biographical requirements in the Bible. Why? Because everything recorded in the Bible is without error. So if you correctly evaluate the historical person that you're examining, then you have to have that standard. Just like with prophets in the days of Israel, right? If a prophet spoke correctly 99% out of the time, he's dead. Because as that 1% comes, he has to be killed. So you've got to have that standard. That it's got to match everywhere that it can match. I then assume, or not assume, but I then assess my relative confidence that this person meets enough biographical requirements to be equated with that biblical figure. So I try to quantify my certainty as being anywhere between 51% and 100%, right? If it's less than 50%, it's a bad move on my part. But I want to try to quantify, what is this roughly? Is this, 55? Is this 85? Is this 99 or 100? So you need to kind of have the integrity to come up with what you think is the right number. And when you get that percentage, it then gives you the proper relative amount of confidence to have in that view. So when you're talking about it, when you're writing about it, you now communicate that level of certainty. The Exodus Pharaoh, I'm 100% sure. There are so many biographical requirements that Amenhotep II fits that nobody else fits in the 18th or 19th dynasty. That it's a slam dunk. He's got to be the right one. And by the way, the most important one, he fits chronologically exactly in that window of time when, according to biblical chronology, the Exodus Pharaoh would have lived. So across the board, it's 100%, right? And again, it's not always that clear, but that's the idea. So if I'm close to 100%, then I feel confident to make my conclusion public, and I publish my findings and again, discuss it in terms of my relative level of confidence.
Okay, well, that's responsible research. Okay, so that's what we're going to dig into. This is how you went about looking for Nimrod and who he could possibly be. So what began your interest in Nimrod?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's even hard to kind of recollect everything that's involved in that because it goes back so far. But probably my interest with Nimrod began with my love for Genesis 1 through 11. It's a foundational text. Yeah. I consider it to be, if you don't mind the term vaccination, I know a lot of people nowadays aren't big on that word.
I was reading that and I thought, wow, he wrote this in 2013.
That's right. Yes. Right.
Yeah.
I consider it to be a vaccination against the virus that was going to be walking and living among the Israelite people as soon as they move into Canaan, right? Because Moses wrote this right before he died in 1406 BC. He wrote this right near the end, and then he handed the baton to Joshua, and then all the people went into Canaan. Moses knew that they wouldn't be faithful to God and kill every Canaanite, man, woman, child, and all their animals, oddly enough. So that means people would be left behind, people alive, Canaanites, Perizzites, Jebusites, all the ites, right?
Right.
And that means you've got moral poison all around you. Why? Because they have a non-God-centered worldview. Whereas the Israelites were God's people, and he used the opportunity of the 40 years in the wandering in the desert to reveal to them revelation so that they could live skillfully and successfully in the midst of people who have a worldview antithetical to God-centered worldview, right? So he's wanting to vaccinate them so that they wouldn't be overcome, right? So what he does is he gives them essentially a God-centered worldview. That's what Genesis 1 through 11 is. So, it talks about beginnings of all kinds of things. How does mankind show up, man and woman? How do you get a man and a woman? They're very different. How do you account for that? How do you account for evil in the world? And, we have the origin of it that's explained. How do you account for the beginning of nations? How do you account for varied languages that people speak, right? All of those things are part of it, but couched in all of that are the questions of worldview. What is ultimate reality? What is mankind? What happens at death, right? Those are some of the specific questions that determine any person's worldview. Every one of us has an answer to those questions, even if we haven't communicated it or written it down. So he's preparing them to live among people who would be harmful to them. So that whole Genesis 1 through 11, it's just really fascinating to me. And that's a part of it. And also, one thing that drew me to Nimrod is that his identity is unknown in ancient texts and inscriptions as such, as Nimrod, or the equivalent in an ancient language, right? It's just, we don't know it. And that sparked my curiosity. And, God made us all curious, right? And we all have curiosities maybe that go in different directions. And that's one of the directions that my curiosity goes. Oh, there's a person and we can't identify him, but he's a very famous person.
Yeah.
Well, why can't we identify him? Maybe he is somebody we can't identify, right? So that curiosity. And I could not find any convincing case that was made by any scholar for identifying him with a particular historical figure. So I basically looked kind of inward and decided that God has given me all of the right training to see if I could identify Nimrod in the ancient historical record. And to be honest, I was quite surprised that God chose me to be the one to make the first persuasive case for who is Nimrod. Why me? As I tell my students all the time, who am I? Who's Dr. P? And that's what, I tell my students to call me because they don't like pronouncing my last name.
The Petrovich.
Yeah. I say, who's Dr. P? Well, Paul talked about me when he said of himself, I'm the chief of sinners and I'm the least of all the saints, right? I think prophetically, he wasn't talking about himself. He was prophetically talking about me. I fit that role, not Paul. So why would God choose me to be the one to identify Nimrod with a historical figure? It's inexplicable to this day. It's inexplicable, but that's kind of the road that I traveled to follow follow the yellow brick interest in Nimrod.
Yeah, and I'm glad you did, because it is a character that has come up, and I never really thought much about him. Really, even as studying scripture and going through seminary and working on my master's and then a doctorate at a different seminary, never thought twice about that. It was always about other things, of course, making a defense, doing, logic and all. So that came later when that name came up, and I thought, wait a minute, I don't know who that is. And, is he a historical? Obviously, he's a historical character. So then we have to look further into who he is, because I started hearing people say he was one person and then it started blending in with mythology from Mesopotamian literature. But
And
we'll get to that.
Karen, can I jump in with one quick point?
Sure.
I think this is really important. Since you were talking, it dawned on me. I can't tell you how important it is that I have full training in a completely different field than biblical studies, right? So a master's degree and a PhD in ancient Near Eastern history and archaeology, right? That allows me to have, at the table, not only all of the training I've received and the learning I've done on my own in biblical studies, but in historical studies and archaeological studies and epigraphy, ancient inscriptions, right? Writing, ancient writing. That's my kind of bread and butter. That's what I jump up and down about the most in ancient history. And so with that, I now become an interdisciplinarian, right? I have multiple fields that I've spent a lot of time and effort to, as much as humanly possible, for my ability and my time, master, right? And the challenge that someone has who would maybe try to do what I did, identifying Nimrod, is maybe without that professional training in historical and archaeological studies, there are so many holes that you can't see that you have, that you probably will not do things the right way, and you probably will not have access to all of the same incredible tools that are out there to be able to accomplish this. So that's a huge part of it that I think we can't underestimate. Does that make sense?
Oh yes, definitely. It's all part of it. It's looking back in time, and especially this far back in history. You definitely need a background in what you have. That's invaluable, and that's why God chose you.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I know from my limited studies in biblical Hebrew that names mean things.
Yes.
So
bingo.
What does Nimrod's name mean?
Yeah. And let me start it off with kind of an overarching statement, which is, with many names, biblical names, we can be kind of, 100% sure what the name means. And it's significant, and it relates to to who they are as a person. And it's my contention, Catherine, and maybe you've read this in something I've written, but not that I'm the only one who holds it, but in the ancient world, especially second millennium BC and probably earlier, which is what Nimrod is. He's earlier. He's third millennium BC. Mm-hmm. In these periods, you don't just get cookie cutter names like today. People just get a name. It's a known name usually, right? In certain cultures here within the United States, that, they go above and beyond that and kind of create names. But most of us get named a name that's already in use, and there's no meaning connected to it. And we get the name at birth. In the ancient world, they didn't get their names at birth. It's more like Native Americans, right? If you were 300 years ago, a Native American family, and you have a child and you see him running by the brook all the time, you're going to name him Running by the Brook, because that's all that people associate with him. He's always down by the brook running around, right? So in the ancient world, they did the same.
Wow.
And names came to mean something connected to something in your life. And here's what it is. Something that distinguishes you. That's what gives you your name. And if names changed, then it meant that something greater distinguished you, or something distinguished you more than what had distinguished you before. And you get this new name, right?
Wow.
Abram has two names. Jacob has two names. Sarah has two names. Every Egyptian king has 5 names. And I'm convinced that Joseph has at least 5 names, right? And all that's in my second book, Origins of the Hebrews. But back to your question. With Nimrod, we can't be 100% sure on him like we can be with other people. There are options, though, that I think we can pretty much limit the field. So the name Nimrod may derive from the Hebrew verb marad. If we can resolve the lack of the N consonant at the beginning. Marad. From Nimrod, the consonants are N, M, R, D. So if you take the last three, M, R, D, then it connects us to this verb, this Hebrew verb, which means to rebel. And it often is used of people rebelling against God. So it's possible. That's definitely possible. Nimrod's name is connected to rebellion. 100% possible. All right, I'll come back to that. So some commentators agree with connecting his name to this verb, and they note usually that his name means we will rebel, and that would account for the N consonant at the beginning. We will rebel. Right. So that's one option. Others merely attribute the Midrash, which is the ancient Jewish commentary on the Bible, and it dates to about the 2nd century AD or later. But some attribute the Midrash with making this association. And if that's true, I mean, in one sense, it's a very ancient connection, but in another sense, there's a lot going on in the Midrash that's kind of making up really interesting things, but very historically questionable things.
Right. So
you have to be careful about putting too much weight on the Midrash. But anyway, so there's good and bad with that connection in the Midrash. But if Nimrod does mean we will rebel, then Moses' choice probably does not reflect his given name or the name that he used of himself. Moses most likely then chose to name Nimrod with a dysphemism. What's that? Well, we have a euphemism, right? We don't talk about the toilet. We talk about the John. Well, we take something that has negative connotations to it and we kind of clean it up. We cleanse it. We take off the bad sound. So we use a word that's not kind of so harmful to the ear, right? That's a euphemism. Then the opposite of that is a dysphemism. What is that? What's a dysphemism? Well, an example is snail mail, right? If you're going to use a letter, put it in the post office, it may or may not get there, but usually nowadays it does. But it probably will take, depending on where you ship it to, send it to 5 to 6 days, right? Why is it called snail mail? It goes slowly like a snail. If you want to get word to someone right away, what do? You send an email, and it's there in seconds or less. So a dysphemism, it's giving a kind of negative spin on a word rather than a positive spin on a word. So it's very possible that Moses decided, I'm going to name Nimrod with this dysphemism. And by the way, if you're wondering, is there a biblical example of this? Yes, there is. Babel is a perfect example.
Oh, yeah.
Who named the city Babel? God, right?
I guess so.
Doesn't Genesis 11 say God did it? He called it?
Okay.
Well, does that mean the city for years and years and years had no name? All the ancient cities had names. So there was a primary name to the city. God gave it a secondary name, and he gave it a dysphemistic name because it means confusion, right? So you're taking that negative spin and putting it on the name of the city and calling it by that negative spin. Confusion. That's the place where people's language was confused. It's the center.
How do we know that it had a different name before that?
Essentially from the precedent that we have that all ancient cities were named. We're named. And
I know that. Go ahead.
There's more to it with Babel. There are 9 sites that have been recognized so far in Mesopotamia and around Mesopotamia, in the ancient world, in the ancient texts. What does that tell us? That's screaming something out at us. It's saying that there's something important about whatever the original city of Babel was. It's so important that other people named their new city after it, because they're finding some kind of connection to it, right? Like, this is the cosmopolitan city of the day. That's the kind of thing, right? This is where languages were confused, or originated at first.
Right.
This is the first urban center on the earth. So there's some kind of big, important characteristics about Babel. That first Babel, if the Bible is referring to the first Babel, and I'm convinced that it is. So other cities named their city after that city, right? So that's screaming out at us that there is a well-known city that can have, its name multiplied in other cities that come after it. Does that make sense?
It does. And that happens here, even in the United States. In your essay, the article that I read, you do kind of go through the steps of, I don't think that's in our questions, but you go through the steps of where was Babel? Where is the Tower of Babel? Where was it really? And so that kind of explains to me, I missed the part that God named it that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so.
And the other answer to your question is, God named it that after the languages already were confused. So all of the long time span from first settling that place as a little, mini community to a village, to a town, to a city, to urbanized city, all of that long process, are we to believe it had no name, right?
Right.
Are we to believe that, unlike any other city in the ancient world, it had no name until it was abandoned and called its name by God, right? So logically, it makes no sense that would be its first name. Zero. It makes zero sense.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I never looked at it that way. That's true. And God never said that. We don't have in the Bible that it was destroyed, just that the people dispersed.
Right. It's abandoned.
So it's somewhere.
Yes. And maybe someday we can talk about that.
That would be great. I mean, this is very, very educational, and I knew it would be. Okay, so Nimrod, we rebel, and this is Moses with a dysphomism, and this is some person who was apparently rebellious for him to give him that name. So, how do you explain Nimrod's recorded genealogy?
Okay, for this
because
one,
there's a lot of, it goes from Ham, and then he is separated, kind of, goes through Ham's descendants with Cush and his children, and then Nimrod is named down the way. So how does that work?
Okay, let's look at this with my showing you my translation of the text, because it's going to be helpful for people to look at the text as I'm talking on this one.
Okay.
So I just did a screen share. Hopefully you can see my screen. Is that visible?
Yes.
Okay. So there's my translation. And if people ask, why, Dr. P, are you giving us your translation? Well, it goes back to something that my third Greek professor taught me and basically embedded in my mind, which is, in a different context, he said to me, Douglas, the danger with standing on someone else's shoulders is that you both may fall. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Very powerful. And if I've been trained well in the original languages, I'm accountable for what I do with how I treat the text of the Bible. And I would much rather study it out very, very carefully and in a detailed way and come up with my own translation than depend on other people whom I don't even know from Adam. I don't know their training. I don't know how much time they put into it. I don't know their theological bents. I don't know their grammatical strengths. So I'd rather use my own translation. So here is the text of Nimrod's biography that more or less begins with verse 7. Now, you don't have verse 6 on here, but according to Genesis 10:6, Cush is listed first among the 4 sons of Ham. The B'nai, which is sons of, so the sons of Ham. Cush, Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for Egypt, by the way. Put, and Canaan, and we know all about Canaan. He's the bad guy, or his descendants, I should say, are bad guys. Now, let's look here at Genesis 10:7, and I'm going to try to, just to be helpful, put up a laser point here. So look at verse 7 here. So it says, the sons of Cush were Seba and Hawilah and Sabta and Ra'amah and Sabteka, while the sons of Ra'amah were Sheba and Dedan. Okay, that's how it starts with verse 7. So 10:7 lists male descendants for only 2 of Ham's offspring, Cush, Ham's biological son, and Ra'amah, Cush's biological son. So, in fact, Cush is listed as having 5 sons of his own, Seba, Hawilah, Sabta, Ra'amah, and Sabteka. The 2 sons attributed to Ra'amah are Sheba and Dedan. Therefore, Moses lists 2 generations that descended directly from Cush, with Sheba and Dedan being Cush's grandsons, not sons, but grandsons. So Moses is being very careful to give all the sons of Cush and 2 of the grandsons. And, it's anybody's guess as to why he doesn't put more grandsons on there. I'm not even sure. But that much is important. And also of crucial importance, I think, to the proper position of Nimrod in his family's genealogical tree. His name is conspicuously absent from the list of Cush's sons and absent from the list of the grandsons. It's not there. This detail becomes crucial in Genesis 10:8, where the text states that Cush sired Nimrod, right? Because here it is, verse 8. Now Cush, and there's a verb here, it's the Yalad verb. Now Cush sired Nimrod. For 2 reasons, however, Cush should not be viewed as the biological father of Nimrod. 1, Nimrod is not listed among the 5 sons of Cush in Genesis 10:7, a list that should be viewed as comprehensive for male offspring, direct sons. What's more, Nimrod is not even listed among the grandsons of Cush who are named in this verse. And if he's a grandson and he's so important, he definitely should be listed among the grandsons, but he's not there. So clearly the author is inferring that Nimrod is not a near descendant of Cush. And we know that from the verb he uses here, but hold off on that. So the second reason why Cush should not be viewed as the biological father of Nimrod is this. The contrast between the sons of from Genesis 10:7 and Yalad, so here sons of versus this verb Yalad, the contrast between them functions as a marker indicating a qualitative difference between Cush's position as the father of his sons and the grandfather of his grandsons versus Cush's siring of Nimrod. And here's the last thought. Back to this verb. So the verb is Yalad, he sired, right? Yalad, he sired. There's a cognate of that. It's like a related word. And it's a noun. It's Yaled, right? So Yalad is the verb, Yaled is the noun. So the cognate noun can mean son, child, or descendant. And it's used of a wide range of progeny, including much later descendants. And the use of a term of close kinship to refer to a distant descendant is not foreign to biblical authors. And if you look in Isaiah 29:23, for example, the prophet Isaiah records the words of God, who states this, that quote, when he, and the name isn't there, but it's inferred from the context of verses before that. It's Jacob. When he, that is Jacob, sees his children, they will sanctify my name. And that's future, right? They will sanctify my name. So this is future from Isaiah's time. And these children of Jacob will sanctify God's name. So since Isaiah lived over 1,000 years after Jacob, no one can deny that descendants are the children in view here, not biological sons or daughters or even grandsons. So Nimrod thus should be understood only as being a remote descendant of Cush, clearly beyond even the possibility of being his grandson. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. So their language is everything. And there was a reason why it was Yalad instead of Bane.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So we're beginning to develop a picture here of Nimrod and who he is and his genealogy. Now, in your studies, you line Nimrod up with Sargon of Akkad. So this is a huge question. I know that you can narrow it down. Why was your conclusion that Nimrod's historical character is actually, we can look at Sargon of Akkad?
Yep. And I'm just going to answer you with big picture, the broadest strokes I can.
Sure.
I'm going to give you 4 big picture reasons without going into the woods on this question.
Okay.
But first, let me tell everybody who briefly Sargon of Akkad was.
Okay.
Sargon of Akkad was the founder of what's called the Akkadian Empire. If you studied Western Civ, probably at the beginning, the first couple of weeks, first couple of days or hours of your class, your professor probably told you about the Sumerians. And maybe he or she said Sumerians, but it's technically, if you're using Akkadian, it's Sumerians, the Sumerians and the Akkadians. The Sumerians were the first civilized culture. That is, they had all of the trappings of an organized state, right? Strong central authority, probably kingship, a legal system, scribes, canalization, which provides any water coming in with irrigation and any sewage channels going out, right? And a defensive wall, and potentially someone making mass pottery for people, and grain production and storage of grain, right? All of these things are characteristic of an urbanized society.
Yeah.
So, and that separates in the ancient world, that separates a true urban center from just a typical city or a village or that kind of thing. Now, so Sargon of Akkad, he lived, maybe it's fair to say the beginning of his life was during the end of what's called the ED period, the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia. Early meaning early, and dynastic meaning there are dynasties popping up all around. Now, what kind of dynasties? Usually they're what we call city-states. It's a city that becomes like this area-wide or region-wide power. And over time, they got into conflict with each other. So then they would fight, and there would be battles, there would be wars, there would be cities destroyed, kings killed, populations killed. It got really ugly in the early dynastic period. I mean, it was a mess. And Sargon rose up in the midst of all of this, or on the tail end, if you want to call it that, of all of this. And he founded a dynasty. And how did he find a dynasty? He found a dynasty by overpowering city-state after city-state after city-state and collecting this mass of territory. And everybody in it is under him. And he expanded into an empire. It's the world's first empire. That's why I call my book, which I published in 2023 on this topic, Nimrod, the Empire Builder.
Right.
That's what Nimrod does. That's what Sargon does. Sargon was the first history is indisputable that he was the first empire builder. He went to the north, up into as at least as far in the north as into Assyria. He went up to the edge of Anatolia, which is modern Turkey. He went on the outskirts of ancient Syria. He claimed some of Syria. He went to the east of Mesopotamia, to what we call Elam, the region of Elam and the Diyala, and even to the south, down the Persian Gulf, by boat, and took cities and areas to the south. So he was the first empire builder. That's who he is. So why did I conclude that Nimrod best lines up with this guy? Mm-hmm. So 4 reasons. First, Nimrod's moral character aligns perfectly with the moral character of Sargon of Akkad, as they both were vicious slaughterers of armies, civilians, and others, and they were irreverent toward God. Okay, so that's first. Their moral character is the same, and it's negative. It's really bad. Mm-hmm. Second, they were both imperialistic conquerors whose exploits showed that they followed exactly the same course for building their empires, right? Which is starting in a city-state in southern Mesopotamia, in Shumer. And for Sargon, he starts at Cush. Nimrod, genealogically, he goes back to what figure? The son of Noah, near descendant of
and
Noah.
Then Cush. Yeah.
Cush and Kish are exactly the same. The only thing that's different is vowel, and vowels mean nothing because they're not recorded in the ancient, in the earliest scripts.
Right.
So, and vowels would change from one culture to the next. So there's a genealogical connection and a physical connection, almost certainly, between them. And so the city of Kish, in my mind, undoubtedly, is named after biblical Cush because of the recollection of him as the forefather, right?
Wow. Okay.
So then both characters expand within southern Mesopotamia and develop a massive kingdom in southern Mesopotamia. They weren't, Sargon at least wasn't the first to capture much of Shumer, but he was the first to capture all of Shumer. And then both of them made Akkad their capital city. What does that take? I mean, that's pretty specific, which was located between upper and lower Mesopotamia. And it's moving to the north, right? And what does Moses do when he gives the city names, the site names of all of the cities that he does list that are conquered by Nimrod? He goes from south to north, and it's a straight shot. It's just like he does in, Numbers 34, I'm pretty sure is the right passage, for the borders of the Promised Land.
Yes.
Borders, yeah. It's like a full movement all the way around and back to the starting point, right? It's very orderly.
Very specific.
Yes. Yeah. And the same specific orderliness is followed in this northerly trek of cities that go up. And as you're going up, you hit Akkad. We know that Sargon of Akkad built the city. So it probably was a town or village or very, very small city before he got there. And then he built it up into a new capital of his own. He kind of wanted his own thing, right? I mean, he grew up in Kish, and he was the cupbearer to the king who was there, and he probably killed the king of Kish to be able to usurp the throne from him, which is pretty crazy. But again, that's the ancient world. And so then from there, he goes up into the north, Sargon goes up into Assyria. Well, what does Nimrod do? He does that very thing. He goes right up into Assyria. And we'll look at that more a little bit in a minute. So, So second, they both conquer Shumer by going from south to north. And third, they both make Akkad their capital city. Fourth, they both conquered Assyria as the prize jewel of their conquests. Why? What's so important about Assyria? It has enormous resources, number one. And number two, it was the best place to be in and around Mesopotamia in the ancient world for access to the trade routes that get you further to the east and further to the west. So it's prime land that you need to acquire so that you can really gain a monopoly on the entire area in and around Mesopotamia. And that's what both characters do. They make Assyria their prized jewel. So, it's follow the leader here. These are matches. The biblical description of Nimrod, it's much more abstract, much more limited in what it provides. And just the fact that there are only several cities of Shumer that are listed in Genesis 10 does not mean at all that those are the only cities of Shumer that he controlled. If he was going to go into central Mesopotamia, right, and build up a new capital city, and then from there springboard into Assyria and capture all of the important parts of Assyria at least, if he was going to do that, he could not do it without controlling all of Shumer, because the city-states of Shumer are way too powerful. So he's got to have control of all of Shumer. Well, what's limited and cryptic in the Bible about Nimrod with his control of cities in Shumer, it's very expressive in the ancient sources about Sargon. It tells you many of the cities of Shumer that he controlled. For those reasons, I think it's pretty cut and dry that Nimrod and Sargon of Akkad are one and the same.
Wow, that really lines up. It really does when we look at it with an objective eye. Okay, so what is the significance of the language used to describe Nimrod's position and how others viewed him?
Okay, I'm going to pop back onto the text for the next few questions here, just so that it's easier to follow me. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so we're back.
Dr.
So
Petrovich, I know we've gone over, and I just want to make sure you have the time to finish up.
Yep.
Are you okay?
I do if you do.
Okay.
So, many or most English translations of Nimrod's biography use words and terms that kind of cloak or hide Nimrod's true character. For example, they say that Nimrod became, let me pop on the laser pointer here, that Nimrod, he, so it's referring, the pronoun refers back to Nimrod. Nimrod became a mighty one on the earth, right?
Yeah.
That's what most translations say. In this case, it's the New American Standard Updated Edition. And this is referring to the word for mighty here. It's referring to the Hebrew word gibor.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem with this translation is not that it's impossible or it's inherently inaccurate. It's not inaccurate to say mighty one. But the problem is that readers of the Bible are used to seeing the term mighty one in a positive or admirable context.
Yes.
Such as King David's mighty men who protected him and always fought valiantly in wars, right? So if you're used to using that word, like the mighty men of David, then you see it here, and what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Positive connotation, right? So as a translator, you've got to take this kind of thing into account. You've got to make sure that your reader understands that it could be more complex than that. It could be different than that initial connection. So the mighty men of David were noble and honorable, but Nimrod is neither. So in my mind, the term also, the term also is used in Genesis 6, but in plural, so giborim, where the mention of evil angelic beings known as the sons of God, it's best translated powerful ones, not mighty ones, because once again, they're vicious. Everything they do is horrible. Yeah. You don't want to use terminology there that makes them out to be kind of, positive. So a better translation. Well, where you typically see, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. That's okay. I prefer now Cush sired Nimrod. I prefer sired because you're confusing your reader here. Remember, Nimrod's not one of the sons of Cush, is he?
Right.
So is it terrible to put father there? No, but we can be more precise and less misleading to our reader. And then where most translations would say he became a mighty one on the earth. Way better to say, and I won't go into all the detail, but you can read about it in my article or my book. That one, and it's what we call far demonstrative. It's like you point your finger kind of far away from you. You point, and there's a person there you're pointing to. That one, that guy, he acted irreverently. That's a way better way to state this. This is not a common to be verb. It's acted irreverently. And then there's the purpose that comes with it, or the result. In order to become powerful on the earth, right? Powerful, it doesn't have an automatically positive connotation, does it?
Right.
So it's a word that is going to connote better, I think, the character of Nimrod as we see him throughout this passage. And we want to be consistent, because I don't think it's fair to think that he's bouncing back and forth like a ditzy blonde. One day he's, horrible. The next day he's Mother Teresa. It's just not the way it goes with this guy.
Right.
So that's kind of how I would want to answer that one. And I'll have more to say when you ask me your next question.
Okay. Okay. All right. Now, when doing a word study of the characterization that Moses uses when describing Nimrod, what can we learn about Nimrod? I kind of feel like you've been answering that.
I have.
The way that he uses Gibor and the meanings of it. I know that when my first semester of biblical Hebrew, my professor, when I saw the word Gibor and we were translating, I thought of it as a valiant, warrior. And he looked at me and he said, not so much. And it's always stuck with me. It's like, okay, so there are other meanings here, other connotations. So we need to be careful how we view some of these characters.
Good for your professor. If he were near me, I would give him a big smile and a firm handshake. And I would say, thank you. So let's look at one more word study here. Okay. So Nimrod, was and again, this is New American Standard, your typical mighty. Once again, I want to go consistently with powerful. But this is the word I want to look at. Hunter. Yeah, he's a mighty what? A mighty hunter? Well, what's the problem with this word being used, this English word? And again, I don't want to say it's impossible to use the word hunter, but as a translator, there are multiple meanings of words, multiple options for translating individual Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic words. And you really want to look to the specific context to pick the best among all the possibilities, right? That's part of the hard work that goes into it. So, the notion of Nimrod as a mighty hunter is extremely attractive to ancient Near Eastern scholars. Catherine, it's like it's a fun thing, right? It's cool to call him a mighty hunter. And there's a reason for it. The militant hero of ancient times was usually a hunter. So there are ancient texts that talk about kings that would go off on a hunt. Right. And so it's fun to kind of take that and stick it into this context, right? And so what would these kings do? They chased lions, they killed wild oxen, or they went on the hunt for boars, right? Or other animals. That's what they would do as a hunter. But there's nothing in the context here that tells us he's going on a hunt for animals, is there? No. Instead, the use of the word hunter in the Nimrod story appears completely out of context. So in studying this for myself, I found a foreign cognate of the Hebrew verb, because Hebrew is one of a number of Semitic languages, right? And sometimes you have to go look at other Semitic languages to help you understand what we call the range of meaning for any word, in this case in Hebrew. And when we do that, here's what we find. And it's Ugaritic that we're going to find, I think, an answer for this. So
Okay.
a foreign cognate of the Hebrew verb sayid, which relates to the addition of the Ugaritic word zabadah, sacrifice. Okay, there is a cognate that matches. So the Hebrew substantive, that's like a word used as a noun. The Hebrew substantive of sayid finds a direct cognate with the Punic construction zabadah sayid, which is the translation being sacrifice of slaughtering. Punic, it's North African. These are Canaanites who literally got in ships and moved to North Africa, right? So they're the same people as the Canaanites.
Okay.
So the Punic construction there means sacrifice of slaughtering. What's the idea? You're sacrificing an animal, and a person takes a whatever, sword, knife, sharp instrument, and cuts the throat or some other part, right? But usually often it'd be the throat of the animal that's killing it, that's sacrificing it, and then it will be burnt up on an altar, right? So the ancient Near Eastern concept of this term either can focus on the food presented, right? Sacrifice of slaughtering. So it's either a focus on the food presented as a sacrifice, it's the dead animal, or on the very act of slaughtering the animal that it is offered as a sacrifice. So in that case, it's the act of slaughtering itself, which if you take that act and you take the participle and you turn it into what we in English would call a gerund, but it's still a participle in the ancient language. It's the slaughterer. It's the person who does the slaughtering.
Okay.
So this means that the nominal form of the ancient Near Eastern word can refer to the person performing the slaughtering, who slaughters living creatures, such as we would have as a butcher. So,
okay,
given the context of Genesis 10:9, how it rules out hunter as a possible and plausible translation here, because there's nothing about going off into a hunt looking for animals, and that the use of Gibor to describe Nimrod probably connotes violent tyrannical power, the best translation seems to be slaughterer or butcher, making Nimrod one who powerfully slaughtered a plethora of human beings. So here it is. Nimrod became a powerful slaughterer in the sight of he goes on existing. If you look ahead, right, at what he does, which we'll talk about in a minute. Oops, wrong way. If you look ahead at what he does, starting in verse 10, he's going around and he's capturing city after city. Now, do you think for one minute that the people of these cities are waving flags saying, we can't believe we're so excited that Nimrod's here. We're going to surrender our city to him. No. They send out an army. The army goes down in flames. Survivors in the city, he besieges the city. They break in. He kills off all the people in the city, right? And he does this city after city, region after region, until he's amassed an empire. So what is he doing to be able to amass an empire? He's doing this. He's demonstrating that he is a powerful slaughterer of people, one who's doing this as a slaughterer of people, not animals this time, but people, in the sight of he goes on existing. That's the covenantal name of God, on account of which it is said. So there's a saying that developed because he was so good at this, everybody noticed, and they used it of future empire builders and conquerors. They said, such and such is just as Nimrod, a powerful slaughterer in the sight of he goes on existing. So Nimrod was so good at this. He was so well-known, renowned as a slaughterer of people and a conqueror of cities that other people looked at him and said, we're just like Nimrod is. We also are powerful slaughterers in the sight of God.
Wow, that just changes so much of this valiant hunter, strong guy who is out there and just doing his thing and
yes,
providing all this game for meals and such. Totally changes the perspective here.
Yes, it does.
Okay. So what do we know about Nimrod's exploits and why Moses would take the time to have the reader focus on this information? And I think you've just answered that.
Yeah, I answered the first half of it, didn't I? And even before I did, right? 10 starts the exploits. The starting point of his kingdom was, and here I'm showing my cards. I'm convinced that of the 9 cities that are called Babel, Eridu is the right one for biblical Babel. Not the Babylon of Daniel's day, that's different, but the Babel of Genesis 10 and 11, that's Eridu.
Oh.
It's the furthest south, and then you go north to Uruk, then you go north to Akkad, and all of these were located in the land of, and rather than transliterate Hebrew, as I always tell my Hebrew students, translate rather than transliterate. The word we use in ancient historical studies for southern Mesopotamia is Shumer. There it is right there. This little accent mark shows us that it's a sh instead of a regular s. Shumer, right? So, and then it says, from that land he went into Assyria. He went further north, right? Remember, we're following this perfectly northerly set of conquests, and that's how any conqueror would do it, right? One at a time, going in a direction.
Yeah.
And he built up, and now it gives us names of cities in Assyria: Nineveh, Rehoboth City, Kalhu, and Rezin. We don't know much about Rezin at all. I can't even tell you where Rezin is. Being located, and meaning Rezin is located. And that's probably why Moses gives us a little information about Rezin, because he knows most people are going to have a hard time finding that, knowing where it is. So he says it's located between Nineveh and Kalhu, which is the great city. And which is the great city? That is called a relative clause. It modifies Kalhu. And I'm convinced, because Kalhu doesn't become a great city until the first millennium BC, meaning after 1000 BC. And Moses is talking about an area in the 3rd millennium BC, and he's writing by 1406 BC. I'm convinced that this relative clause was added later as what we call a scribal update by a later Hebrew scribe, not Moses. But that's a whole different story, not so important to our purposes. But all of this shows the exploits of what he accomplishes. And then you asked, in the second part of that, you asked the why question. Why would Moses take time to have the reader focus on this? And that's the last part of my answer, which is, and it goes back to, what's the purpose of Genesis 1 through 11? It's a part of this whole thing. Moses knows that there is going to be a future king of Israel. How? Because if you look in Deuteronomy, God revealed to Moses a bunch of qualifications, actually 5 qualifications. He's got to be a native Hebrew. He can't multiply wives. He can't multiply gold, right? So those are 3 of the 5, and there's 2 more. So that's the future. And God is revealing this to Moses centuries before Israel would ever have a king. What does that mean? It means Moses knows 100% certain, cut and dry, there will be a king. So what's Moses doing with this passage, with the Nimrod pericope, we call it, or the Nimrod biography, if you prefer? He's preparing the future monarchy of Israel for what's going to come when they do have kings sitting on the throne. And it's giving a model of what you should not be as a king who leads Israel. You don't want to be one who acts irreverently. Your goal isn't to become powerful on the earth.
Right.
You're not to be slaughtering people in the sight of God so that people will look at you and say, oh yeah, we know that guy, the king of Israel. He's a powerful slaughterer, or such and such in a later day is just as the king of Israel, a powerful slaughterer in the sight of God.
Wow.
That's bad, right? That you go out and conquer all these cities. That's bad. That's not what you're supposed to do. Now, within the promised land, that's different. The promised land is the promised land. But this guy, whoever Nimrod is, He goes out of his own territory into other territories and conquers a lot of places that he shouldn't be setting his foot there. He's becoming too powerful. He's becoming too prideful, too accumulating too much, becoming too ruthless, right? So all of these negative character qualities, they just ooze out of a person the more powerful and wealthy you become. If you don't believe me, look at politicians today and you'll know.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I
was thinking history repeats itself over and over again. We see what's happening with the CCP right now, and we'll see what happens there. Okay, we have just a few minutes left, but
yeah, you can pick one or the other if you want.
Pardon me?
You can pick one or the other of the last two if you want.
Okay, let's do, because the Gilgamesh thing, I mean, it's pretty much, you've already laid out why you think it's Sargon. I think the Gilgamesh is more of a, let's just kind of put him in there idea. So I don't.
He doesn't fit the biography. That's the bottom line. He just doesn't fit the biography.
So we'll go to the last question. In both antiquity and modern, and modern times, some people have suggested that Nimrod was connected to the events at the Tower of Babel. Is this a valid connection historically?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I really deal with this in depth in my book, which it's in the introduction, I think, or the introductory chapter to the book. So you won't find it. I don't treat it in the article, right? Because in the article I only had, it was longer than it should have been. It was 13,000 something words. I kind of almost got in trouble with the editor of the journal, but in my book I had unlimited word count. So I added this section on this, dealing with this question, because I know a lot of people ask it. Why do they ask it? Well, because Nimrod in chapter 10 is discussed one chapter earlier than the events at Babel, which is chapter 11. Many people have suggested that Nimrod is to be connected to the confusing of languages, right? And some people would even say, because it comes first, Nimrod comes first, he's got to be connected with the Tower of Babel. But that's a dangerous game, okay? The reality is that Nimrod lived long after the events that unfolded at Babel. So Babel came first, Nimrod came second. Let me walk through a few things here with you. One literary convention that Moses often employed in Genesis is the composition of a broad panoramic timeline, big picture, 40,000 feet, if you will, flying your airplane high. So it's a panoramic timeline that carried the narrative, the set of events, from one relatively distant time earlier in history to an opposite relatively distant time later in history. Then, after writing this general account of events over a larger time span, composed a more detailed but temporally more limited story that fits within that broader time frame. And it's kind of like, if you want to picture this, picture that you're flying over a forest in a plane. You're going 40,000 feet, right? And you're just seeing the high points. Oh yeah, I can see that group of trees or that part of the forest or whatever, and then you go into a river. Imagine flying back over it, and now you're going to parachute down in. You jump out of the plane, your parachute works, praise the Lord. You land right in the forest, and then you get out your kit, right? Your chemistry kit or your microscope or whatever you get, and you examine things in the forest in great detail. That's what Moses does over and over and over in the book of Genesis. Far too many commentators don't see this, don't pick this up. It happens all over the place in the whole book of Genesis. One quick example, the creation account. There aren't two creation accounts, chapter 1 and chapter 2. No. Right. There's one big picture flying over the forest at 40,000 feet. That's Genesis 1:1 through 2:4. I call that the order of creation. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. Then in 2:5 through 25, what does Moses do? He puts a parachute on your back, puts you in that little biplane. You're flying lower over, and you drop down, you parachute in, and you're zooming in on day 6 of creation, right? That's what's going on there. And he does the same thing over and over. Chapter 10 of Genesis is in one of those big picture 40,000 feet moments, in the midst of a genealogical tree, if you will. It allows the writer, it allows Moses to kind of talk about big terms, long term, major events, kinds of things, but not jumping down and parachuting down and getting in the weeds. No. Chapter 11 is parachuting down into the weeds. But chapter 11 it fits within the greater picture of what's in chapter 10, just like Genesis 2:5 through 25 on day 6 of creation fits within 1:1 through 2:4 in that big picture day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7th day rest, right? That's how it works literarily. That's really important in all of this, okay? So that being the case, you can't move through the text through chapter 10 through chapter 11 and just kind of rigidly assume or assert that we have to be going chronologically every moment. No, that's not taking into account Moses's clear literary device. Okay, so that's one thing. Genesis 11:4 clarifies how Babel is the first city that was built after the global flood. Now, when it says city here, it's not talking about a village that turns into a large village, which technically is a city, but he's talking about urbanization. All those things I mentioned to you before: strong central authority, canalization, so a sewage system, defensive city wall, public works, administration, monumental architecture, right? All of these things that are characteristic of an urban society. That's what this place is. It's the first to receive it, right? So, Babel is the first city that was built after the global flood. Given that the people in Shumer said, come on, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky, right? The building goes way up into the sky. Now, don't think in terms of this is the abode of God. That's the wrong way to interpret the Hebrew word shemayim here. It has nothing to do with where God lives. Nobody's building a building into God's home, okay? Terrible interpretation. This is into the sky. It hadn't been done before. Nobody's building buildings that go up way into the sky. With this one, they did. So it's different. It's unique. It's the first of its kind. Then confirmation comes in Genesis 11:5, where it says that, quote, he goes on existing, came down to see the city and the tower that the sons of mankind had built. Okay? If it were in God's backyard, he'd see it in his backyard. He came down to earth to see it. What made an occupational site a true city in the ancient world is the advent of urbanization, a strong central administration, urban planning, public works, civil security, marketplace economy, and a massive labor force that worked to create and sustain the city's infrastructure and monumental architecture. Without these components of urbanization, an ancient site simply is less than a full-blown city. Now, let's put these two juxtaposed. In stark contrast to the cityless landscape that existed before the events that begin in Genesis 11:1, in contrast to that, in Genesis 10 through 12, the biography of Nimrod, the text states that Nimrod's kingdom consisted of at least 7 cities: Eridu, Uruk, Akkad, Nineveh, Rehoboth City, Kalhu, and Rezin. And as I suggested to you, as I argued, this is the beginning. Moses isn't giving the whole package of cities. He's just giving high points, and that's all.
Right.
The whole point of the Nimrod story is to document the utter evil that can be unleashed when a city appoints a king who, when he gives himself over to a lust for conquest, can invade other sovereign cities. Then decimate innocent residents through warfare and bloodshed, then incorporate those cities into his own dominion that was pieced together by a craving for unlimited power. So it must be considered completely illogical. And get this, okay? It's illogical to propose that a story with many urbanized cities on earth, that's the Nimrod story. Many urbanized cities, Nimrod's going out and conquering existing urbanized centers, right?
Yeah.
So it's illogical to propose that a story with many urbanized cities took place before a story with one urbanized city on earth, or it was going to be in the process of coming to that. So such a model simply would not spawn from anyone with formal training in ancient Near Eastern history. It's impossible for Nimrod. Nimrod is a king, right? He's a king among kings. He's a king who goes out and conquers kings. When they started building Babel, there were no kings. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, wow.
Well,
that is how it happens. And we see that pattern even today. Dr. Petrovich, thank you so much for your time. This has been incredible. And anyone out there, I would watch this again and take notes. Also, where can people find your writings and your books?
Sure. So my first book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, which claims and argues that Hebrew is the language behind the world's oldest alphabet, and Hebrews invented it. So that book you can only buy from Carta. That's my publisher in Jerusalem. And I can get you a web address for that. But you can't buy it in North America anymore because scholars hated it so much that they convinced Carta's North American distributor, which is called Hendrickson Publishers. Some of you know of it. They convinced Hendrickson not to sell it anymore in North America. That's called censorship.
Yes.
Right? Censorship.
Yes.
They don't like the conclusions. They don't want the book to be viewed by people. My second book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, you can buy on Amazon or from me with a signed copy, and I get a better royalty. And you can go to my Twitter page, and you can click the pinned tweet, and it will give you the information how to do that.
Okay.
And then my third book, Nimrod the Empire Builder, what we were talking about, same thing. You can buy it on Amazon, or you can buy it from me with a signed copy. And then the journal article that you referred to, that if you want something cost free, my article that does this, the 2013 article, that's downloadable for free from my academia.edu webpage. So what you do, you type in the Google or whatever, your web browser tagline or whatever, you type in academia.edu space Douglas Petrovich, enter. And that will take you, the first link that it would come up would be a link you can click to take you right there. Okay.
Please send me any, like your Twitter page or address,
link.
X, and where the other link to the book that has been censored. This is nothing new.
Right.
So yes, so that people can order that and get on board and start reading and looking at this in an academic sense and objectively, instead of just kind of mixing mythology in there. So thank you again. I hope to have you back, and we'll talk about some other things if you'd like.
Absolutely, Catherine.
I think we went back and forth with some really good topics that would be fantastic to learn about.
Mm-hmm. I'll be glad to come back, glad to serve, glad to build into the body and encourage God's people that there is historical reliability of the Bible like you can't believe. That's what I've devoted my life to, right? That's why I write what I write and publish what I do and go and speak at conferences and so forth, because I want God's people to know you can trust the historical matters of the Bible, even though, and as you probably know this, Catherine, we send our kids into universities, public usually universities.
Yeah.
One of the things they receive is a is an earful from professors who hate the Bible and hate the historicity of the Bible and try to persuade our kids you can't trust it. And what they do, they try to persuade you that if you can't trust the historical nuggets in there or moments in there, then that reflects how you also can't trust the spiritual message. Right? So that's the danger.
It's a big danger. And that's why I resonate with your work. That's why I do what I do.
Amen.
Thank you so much. And we'll see you again, maybe in the new year. I can get you back on.
All right. Thank you, Catherine.
All right. God bless you.